I'm Robert Polito from the New School Writing Program, and it's a great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this special program with David Rosenberg. I was reminded of this while David and I were talking in our office. And this isn't a word that I don't think I've used before this evening to describe somebody who's reading and talking here, but I think David is one of the great visionary thinkers of our time. And as we were talking in my office, as our conversation ranged from poetry, it turns out that David was Robert Lowell's teaching assistant when Robert Lowell taught at the New School in the early 1960s, or to the Canadian avant-garde, or to science and the Everglades, and almost anything actually but the subject of this evening's talk on the Bible, is that the largeness of his mind combined with the specificity and the concreteness of his focus, I think, is part of what makes him really extraordinary. His many books include An Educated Man, a dual biography of Moses and Jesus, Abraham, the first historical biography, of course, the Book of Jay, presented in collaboration with Harold Bloom, the Book of David, and of course the book that we're celebrating tonight, his bold and audacious and powerful A Literary Bible. So please join me in welcoming David.
Wow, that's the most and the least words I've ever heard about myself. Sometimes it goes on for a while, but really what does it amount to? But that sounds interesting. Now, where's the camera? I don't want to be thinking about it, I just want to know where not to look. Okay. Like Robert said, I assume some of you are New School students? Some of you? Writing program? Oh, great. I was a student here back in the early 60s. Must be a better way to do this. And at that time, there was no four-year program for undergrads. I was an undergrad. There was just a two-year program, and you matriculated either by transferring 2 years from another college or transferring. I went here 2 years and then transferred all my credits to the University of Michigan to get a degree. And at that time, there were 20 of us, about. That's about as many, similar to the amount in this audience. And the fact is, though, that there were so few of us, and we were all in different classes. I mean, basically all the classes I was in, I was the only matriculated student, usually the teacher's assistant, which reduced my tuition. And so we hardly knew each other, and there were never any reunions. There was only one person there that I ever kept in touch with, not anymore, but I used to, and that was Gerard Malenga, who got famous by acting in Andy Warhol movies. Even that was a long time ago. And otherwise, whenever we'd run into each other, it would always be a surprise. And because we were so interesting, all of us had interesting stories about how we got there and what we were doing there, because not too many people were interested in going to a college with 20 students. And so it's a shame. I've tried to Google some of the names I remember, and I really haven't come up with anything. Anyway, in the Jewish tradition, when you get together to talk about the Bible or any kind of prayer session in a synagogue, or synagogues are always called houses of study. That's basically what they were. You had to have at least 10 people to have a service or a study session. That was called a minyan. If you had 10 people, it didn't matter if you had 1,000. 10 or 1,000, as long as you had 10, if there was only 9, you couldn't do anything. So That's what it was like at the New School back in the early 60s. As I was telling Robert, I was Robert Lowell's assistant. And it was my job to often remind him where he was in the text that he was reading when he would lose his place. And it eventually, which I didn't say to Robert, eventually taught me to think like him, because I would be worried in advance already where he was going to lose his place. And so I already knew how to think about what he was going to do. I'm going to just make a few preliminary remarks. Then I'm going to read for about 20 minutes. Then I'm going to ask you for a few questions, and then I'll read another 10 minutes based on the kind of questions you ask me, because I never know from an audience what's on their mind. And if I just wait till the end for your questions, there's hardly any chance to follow up with anything. Is that okay? And the preliminary remarks, just a few minutes. Also, I'll make a few remarks about what I read from too while I do it, because commentary is an integral part of the Hebrew Bible. It's made up of a lot of commentary itself, in addition to later commentary on it. In my lifetime, there was a big change about thinking about the historical lives of biblical figures, biblical writers. The big change, of course, is that no one even thought of the biblical writers. But the biblical figures, the big change was this. My parents, who were Jewish, but assimilated Americans, but anybody, Jewish, Christian, generally thought of, say, Jesus or Moses. Let's take Jesus, because I've written a book concerning him recently. It was already understood that Jesus was a Jew, and he was pretty much in touch with the same tradition as any Jew at the time. But the idea of him being Jewish was that he was someone who rejected Judaism and went on to found Christianity. That was sort of the basic idea. And that fit really well with the Christian view and even the Marxist view. And it also fit well with my parents too, because they didn't really care to feel that they had to know much more about him. But in the last few decades, just very recently, studies in the historical figures like Moses, Jesus, and many other figures, and the writers, because all of the writers of the Hebrew Bible and most of the New Testament were Jewish writers who were working in a long tradition of writing. There was no Old Testament or New Testament in there at that time that existed for them. It was just a tradition of writing, and it was a tradition of classics behind the writing, world classics, just the way you can be an American writer today, but you're also conscious of the fact that there's a canon of Western culture that you ought to know who Tolstoy is, for instance, even if you don't read Russian, and so on. And this was true of all the writers of the Bible as well. So my lifetime is basically is associated with that change. And I began to ask the question very early, who were the writers and what were they doing? And of course, there were very few answers in the scholarly literature. And it wasn't until the late 80s that a book came out called Who Wrote the Bible? That was a semi-bestseller. It's probably still in print. I don't recommend it, by the way. And in it, the author, a Bible scholar, suggested that, and made some speculative suggestions about who wrote what, and suggested, for example, that Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, also wrote parts of Deuteronomy, things like that. And in other words, his idea of the biblical writer was another biblical figure. And although he was astute enough to know that most of the writing attributed to Moses was not written by Moses, He still was looking for other figures within the Bible to justify who might have written it. It was still very hard for him to imagine the writers as, we think of writers today. But I, for some reason, was born this way. It never occurred to me that they weren't like the writers today. I mean, you become a writer. When you become a writer, you have to be educated. You have to know languages. I mean, there weren't many translations of Tolstoy available to the biblical writers. And the equivalent of Tolstoy were the great Sumerian writers, for example, or Egyptian. So they had to read Egyptian. They had to read Mesopotamian languages, which they did. And of course, this wasn't your average Jewish person. This was the upper class, ruling classes, as it is in all ancient societies. Many things started to become available to me to pull together that hadn't been pulled together before, like archaeology, sociological and cultural studies of both the Bible and ancient history, and parallel cultures. If you know what the court culture was in a Mesopotamian society called Akkad, then you had an idea of what it would also be like in Jerusalem under Solomon, things like that. And then there were the literary probes into authorship. But I can't mention many of those because I don't know too many. That's how the Book of J came about, as I tried to convince Harold Bloom it was necessary to do. It's much better to not have a name for the author. I mean, the letters stand for something, J, for example, but it doesn't matter. It's just like a pseudonym. A lot of writers use pseudonyms. George Eliot was a pseudonym, wasn't it? What was her real name? It wasn't George, or was it? Well, it doesn't matter. But the point is, okay, so we call her J, whatever you want to call her, it doesn't matter. But you don't want to call her Jeremiah or anybody that right away gives you associations of a different kind. You don't need them. This is a discrete new author. J wrote the earliest strand of the part of the Hebrew Bible known as the Torah, and scholars have sorted out the other ones for several, almost 150 years now, that scholarship. But the trouble is, all of the scholarship that's shown you the difference between J and E, all based on pedagogical studies, never envisioned these authors as real people, flesh and blood writers. They were always just a kind of strand, or a certain type of style. But of course, these were real writers, and it wasn't long before the late 70s where I was actually walking on a street in Jerusalem, in the Old City, that was more or less the actual street of coffee houses that the Jerusalem authors of the early Bible were sitting in, talking about what they were writing. And it was very interesting to go into that research. I then found out that I had to change the word coffee house to tea house because they didn't have coffee then, it was just tea. But that they were importing. Solomon was a great importer from the Indies. So as I got more interested in the writers, I got very interested in this one thing that's at the real bottom nature of what I'm doing with the Bible and really Western culture. And that is separating the historical from the supernatural. A lot of people have trouble with those terms, although they're fairly... Supernatural means not natural, but and historical means as best we can determine historically. Now, the original biblical writers of the Hebrew Bible, and even of the New Testament, That is the authors behind the gospel that eventually turned into the ones 70, 80 years later that you see in the New Testament called Mark, Luke, John, and so on. The original writers in the Jewish tradition were much more interested in history than in the supernatural. And the way that things turned out, the fact that Jewish religion had to develop into a religion because, in order to survive, because of the first Holocaust back in 586 BCE, or even before that, it's turned into not so much a religion, but a culture. It would be like if America was wiped out and you wanted to remember Walt Whitman and Herman Melville and so on. You can't say American literature is now a new subject, because if America was wiped out, then obviously the powers that be are anti-American. So you're going to have to call them something else. And Judaism was a religion in exile for a while, and eventually found its way back to Israel. And once you begin to ask these questions about history, and you realize that the original writers had their own history. It isn't like the J writer who's writing in the 9th century BCE, knew what we knew. It's that she knew so much more that we don't know anymore. We've forgotten, because she had her history. Because in the 10th century BCE, if you went for a walk half a mile outside of Jerusalem, you were stepping on fossils. You're stepping on old bones. There's no way you didn't know that there had been many, many millenniums of people before you. These people lived with a sense of history. And these were not myths or supernatural. These were real bones, pottery shards, whatever. They had their own museums. There are records now, and all this is very recent research, in Sumer of the museums of Ur, the proto-city of Western civilization, in which there were many museums. And I studied this. It's very interesting. They're better than a lot of our museums. But the fact is, I'm saying all this to just give you a sense that my concern was with the writers as writers living in a culture, and it's very different than thinking of Jay, as most scholars do, just as a concept. Even my collaborator, Harold Bloom, had a hard time with this. He tended to think of all writers as critics anyway. But when he thought of them as writers, he actually started to get a bit naughty. I mean, he started to call Jay Bathsheba, which in Hebrew, Bathsheba, who was the apple of King David's eye, and therefore a potential woman, educated woman of the upper classes, who could have been part of the royal court. But really, this is just a naughty way of Harold dealing with the subject. He didn't really want to go into thinking of what these writers were like. He would compare some of Jay's writing to Kafka, for example, but it was not a question of the Jay writer being like Kafka as a writer, because she didn't have a biography. She didn't have a group of friends. She didn't have a history to write against. And I was always advocating for that. And that led to, ultimately, this book, which I'm going to read you. It consists of 18 books of the Hebrew Bible, each written by a different author, some more than one author. I'm just going to read from 4, just little pieces. But you'll at least have the sense of how different each one of these writers are. And when you read most translations, even the King James, you don't get this, because the King James is all written as if it's all written by one person, even one supernatural person. So the style is totally coherent all the way through, mostly. And but that's not the way it was. It's interesting, an interesting work of literature is the King James translation, but it's a different thing. And I thought that I just mentioned one last thing. There's a guy at Yale named David Galerner. You probably heard of him because he's a computer science genius. But he's also a biblical scholar, part of him that most people don't know, and I've been in touch with him. And one quote I've taken from an email from him says, "If the book of Job was written by a writer named Sophocles, the whole history of Western culture would be different." Now, actually, he said this just as a way to encourage me. But what he meant by this was that the book of Job, people take it seriously and they read it, but we don't know of an author for it. And even when they do think of something called the Joban author or something like that, look how different that is than Sophocles. If you're a writer today, and you use anything even remotely relative to the Oedipus complex, or Oedipus, or anything in theatrical terms, if you're a playwright, then Sophocles is a source for you. He's a real source, and he has been in the history of the English language, or at least since the Renaissance, right? And in other languages. But there's nothing like that for Job, which is every bit as good as any play by Sophocles. Because there is no Sophocles behind Job. So my job was to put somebody behind the biblical text so that you as writers one day, and me myself if I get to live to be really old, can actually use them as sources. You know, now you'll find evidence, quotes from the Bible and references to all kinds of things in the Bible, but they're not sourced to authors. They're just sourced to stories, quotations, or something like that. And they don't have historical context or cultural context. So that's what we want. I wanted to do this the easiest way possible, and instead of just, becoming a scholar all my life, I thought if I just translate this way, then you'd get it just from reading it. But after 35 years of doing that, I see it's much harder than I thought to get people to think this way for lots of reasons that I can't go into. So let me read you a little bit and see if I've provoked any questions from you. I'm going to start from just a little bit of Genesis, and this is the J writer. You'll see that this section which is the story of the building of the temple in Babylon that ultimately fell down, a story you've all heard, was actually referring to the temple in the city of Ur. Ur was the city where Abraham was born. It was actually a real cultural center at the time, with lots of writers and libraries and museums. And of course their written form, which was already 1,000 years old, was cuneiform. I'm going to read you, it's only a little over a page long, this part. Now listen, all the earth uses one tongue, one and the same words. Watch. They journey from the east, arrive at a valley in the land of Sumer, settle there. We can bring ourselves together, they said, like stone on stone, use brick for stone, bake it until hard. For mortar, they heated bitumen. If we bring ourselves together, they said, we can build a city and tower, its top touching the sky, to arrive at fame. Without a name, we're unbound, scattered over the face of the earth. Yahweh came down to watch the city and tower, the sons of man were bound to build. They are one people with the same tongue, said Yahweh. They conceive this between them, and it leads up until no boundary exists to what they will touch. Between us, let's descend, baffle their tongue until each is scatterbrained to his friend. From there, Yahweh scattered them over the whole face of the earth. The city there came unbound. That is why they named the place Bavel. Their tongues were baffled there by Yahweh. Scattered by Yahweh from there, they arrived at the ends of the earth. Now this tower of Babylon that is being referred to was the actual ziggurat, is what they were called in those days, of Ur. And there are various references to it later that back that up. For example, one more little suggestion. One more page from Jay, a little later. I am Yahweh, who drew you out from Ur of the Chaldeans, he said to him, to give you this land as heir. Lord Yahweh, he said, how may I show it as mine to possess? Bring me a heifer of 3, he said to him, a she-goat and ram, 3-year-olds also, a turtle dove and a fledgling dove. All these he brought, cut down the middle, placed each one's half opposite the other. The birds he left unparted. And the vultures descended on the carcasses. But Abram scared them off. Now look, as the sun goes down, a deep sleep falls over Abram. A covering darkness thrown over him. Underneath, he is plunged in fear. Know this within, he said to Abram. Your seed will be strangers in a land not theirs. Slavery will be their state. Plunged in it for 400 years. Yet the nation which enslaves them will also know judgment. After, they will come out prosperous, surrounded with it. You will come to your forefathers peacefully, when good and old be settled in your grave. They will be a 4th generation before they return. That long will Amorite contempt build until the glass is full. So it was. The sun gone, darkness reigns. Now look, a smoking kiln and its blazing torch pass between the parted bodies. It was that day Yahweh cut a covenant with Abram. I gave this land to your seed from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. Now, let me make a couple comments about this. This is one of many scenes called covenantal scenes, scenes in which the supernatural, as represented by God or Yahweh, is on the same stage, on a par, what I call a cosmic theater, on the same stage as a man, a human being. They're interacting on the stage. They can't interact in any other way because it's far too dangerous. Now, this way of cutting a covenant, everything described here sounds very exotic, but it was somewhat of a convention back in the time. But in the day that this was written, it was already a primitive convention. It was as if I told you today that there's going to be a new peace treaty between the United States and Iran, and we're going to sacrifice 100 goats on the steps of the White House. That's what we go. Obviously, if I wrote that, no one will believe it. No one will believe it. And that's true. And at the time, it was just as unlikely that anyone reading this, the original audience, actually would have believed this was not something done in their day. But for them, it had historical resonance. And it has, and it's been proved to have historical resonance. And it's been brought by the writer, who's totally concerned with being historically accurate, onto this cosmic stage where Yahweh can talk to Abraham and tell him that he's eventually going to get this covenant. But the point is, from the beginning, and in every other covenantal scene, the covenant is real. It's a real thing that's being done. What we might look at it as theater, because it's way beyond ritual. But what it is the idea that a writer in that time understood very well. And that is, since God, just to get a little theology in here as salt and pepper, since God is supernatural, he's really not attuned to time the way that we are. I mean, after all, he's not going to die. He's always going to be living in this unchanging state. He's not even going to change. But he's created this incredibly interesting world where everything changes and dies and gets reborn and so on. But he can't fully understand that world because he's not of it, of course. And it's the same way for us humans. It's almost impossible to imagine a form of life existing outside of time. Although if you watch the latest PBS science documentaries, you will know that there are new theories of a multiverse, extra universes outside of our own, in which time does not exist. But let's not go there, except to say that even at this time, 3,000 years ago, these writers thought in the same way we would today. They knew that this was not knowable. It just was not knowable. But in order for a man and something representing the unknowable to come together, there had to be really careful construction of a theater in which this could happen so no one got hurt. Because it would be easy for God to make mistakes about whether people live or die or how they live or die and so on, because it's not that familiar to him, and vice versa. Anyway, one more thing about this passage. The very first line, to connect to what I just read to you, said, I am Yahweh who drew you out from Ur of the Chaldeans. And this is the text that we have in the King James too, and in the original Hebrew. But Chaldea did not exist at the time that this was written. The Chaldean civilization only began in the 8th century BCE. This was not only written a century before that, but was referring to the time of Abram, later Abraham, many centuries, as much as 8 centuries earlier. So at that time, Ur was the capital of Sumer, which is called Shinar in the Bible. And at that time, as I told you before, Ur was a great cultural capital. When so what the writer is doing by mentioning all the Chaldeans there is he's telling you, the audience, in the 9th century BCE, he's telling you, this is Ur where Chaldea is now, just so you know where it is. But it's not Ur of the Chaldeans, really. The real Ur was long before the Chaldeans, a civilization far, far more culturally developed than the Chaldeans ever became. And so, of course, people mix this up all the time, and this isn't even supernatural. I mean, they think, well, Ur is just some kind of backwater. Unless you go back to Sumer, you will never know that. Now, that's a little bit of Jay. You see, she writes as if she's presenting a scene on a stage. And all of it is like that. There's another writer of Genesis called E, the other main literary writer of Genesis. E is his pseudonym. He was writing about a century later, and he thought of himself as much more modern than Jay. And so in his vision of how you present this cosmic theater with the supernatural and the human interacting, it had to only happen in a dream. See, they were so much more modern, and they said, come on, nobody's going to believe that theater where, Yahweh is talking to Abraham. But in a dream, anything can happen. We still believe that, because it does. Anything does happen in a dream. And so all the interactions between God and Abraham in the E and other biblical figures, in the E portion, in E writing, is done in the form of a dream. And furthermore, E is one of the only writers who's not writing in Jerusalem. He's writing in the capital of the northern part of Israel, which was called Samaria at that time. And that was a new capital, a gorgeous new city, and had its own court and king. And he was using a lot of the same source material that Jay was using, going way back to Sumer. Like I said, they both went to the same libraries. There were great ancient libraries of cuneiform texts piled up high on everything from stone to skin to papyrus to whatever. And so I'm going to read you one little story that you know too well, but you've probably never thought of this way. And that is the story, just a part of the story, of Abraham and Isaac when Isaac is potentially sacrificed, called to be sacrificed by his father, right? Now usually when this is translated, as it is in King James and everywhere else, it's not in the same style as Jay, and so you really don't notice any difference. And it's still hard to persuade anybody. There are textual differences that you can tell this is Z and not J. Different kind of idioms are used and so on. But that's not crucial to a writer. What's really crucial to a writer, I mean, it doesn't matter if in the 60s you used a term like far out. And that everyone knew it, thought that was cool back in the 60s. So if you use far out today, it would sound like either you're really, not with it, or you're using it as an anachronism on purpose, one or the other. And of course, this is 100 years later. So anyway, what most people, I'm going to tell you in advance just to make it easier for you to listen. The story of Abraham being called by God to sacrifice his son, I don't believe it. And I know I have all kinds of reasons for it. And if Kierkegaard was here, who wrote a whole book about it, I would love to argue with him about it. I don't know how well he read Hebrew. But in any case, it's a dream. This is a dream that Abraham is having. And like I said, anything can happen in dreams. Dead people can talk to you. Supernatural beings can talk to you. This dream is actually a certain kind of dream. It's called a nightmare. It's a nightmare dream. And it's written that way, and you'll see how different it is from the J part I just read you. Because it's written almost as if the author is trying to sleepwalk you through it. And sometime later, after these things had happened, God tested Abraham, speaking to him. Abraham, I am listening, he answered. And God said, please take your son, whom you love, dear as an only son, that is Isaac, and go out to the land of Moriah. Let me just stop there a second. He didn't know his son was named Isaac? And why would I have to go to Moriah? Well, anyway, these are all things that happen in dreams. There you will make of him a burnt offering on a mountain of which I will tell you when you approach. And Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young workers to go with him and his son Isaac, having already split the wood for the burnt offering, and he started out for the place of which God had spoken to him. It was on the 3rd day, Abraham looked out in the distance, and there, afar, was the place. And Abraham turned to his young men, you will wait here by yourselves with the donkey, while the youth and I go on ahead to worship, and then we will return here to you. You only get donkeys like this in dreams. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, laying it upon Isaac his son, and in his own hands he took the flint and the knife. Then the two walked on together. At last, Isaac spoke to his father, Abraham. "Father, I am listening, my son. We have the flint and the wood to make the fire, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God will reveal his lamb, my son, for the burnt offering." And the two walked on together, and they approached the place of which God had spoken. There Abraham prepared an altar, set the wood upon it, then bound his son Isaac and laid him there on the altar, lying upon the wood. Abraham reached out with his hand, taking the knife to slaughter his son. But a voice was calling to him, an angel of the Lord calling from out of heaven. "Abraham, Abraham, I am listening," he answered. "Do not lay your hand upon the youth. You will not do anything to him. For now I know yours is an integrity, dedicated to God, and not holding back your son, your dear one, from me." Then Abraham looked around, and there, behind him, its horns tangled up in a thicket, a ram had appeared. And Abraham went over to it, carrying the ram to the wood for a burnt offering instead of his son. The name of that place was given by Abraham, meaning the Lord reveals. And today we still say the mountain of the Lord is revelation. Now there's a little more to that story, but that is the nightmare dream, and there are all kinds of details in it you wouldn't expect from a normal historical narrative or even a parable. I hope you could hear some of them, but the crucial thing is this. Then Abraham looked around, and there behind him, and the story of the ram, that's when he woke up. And what happened after he woke up was everything's real again. And everything real is a real ram who actually woke him up because it was struggling in the thicket making this noise. And you know you can get woken up out of a dream when there's some kind of noise going on around. And that's how it works. And then the writer, E, is telling you Abraham named the place. It has a Hebrew name, but the translation means the Lord reveals. And then the writer says to you, and today we still call this, today we still say the mountain of the Lord is revelation. In other words, he's turned the name of this place, let's say New York, and we don't know it. Do you know what York means? No, I don't even know what it means. I know what New York means. It means not old York. But I don't really know what the word York came from. For all do you know?
His name after the governor.
Yeah, but where did he get his name? No, it's like if your name is Smith, you know, because someone back there was a blacksmith, right? Well, what was a York? A milkman? I mean, I don't know. So I'm just saying, we don't ask these questions, but the Bible writer always does, not because he knows, but because he knows we can never know, and that we have to do something with it. And what he's done with it is to talk to you directly, the audience who is now awake, like with Abraham. He's saying now, in our day, not 8 centuries earlier with Abraham, we still use that term, the Lord reveals, in this expression. The mountain of the Lord is revelation. And all that is tremendously interesting when you want to find out what revelation really means and how the biblical authors thought of it as something very historical and not supernatural. But that's for another day when I get invited back and Robert is the dean of the school. One more little piece, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. And the last thing I'm going to read you after the questions is from the book of Judith. So I hope you'll stay for that, because you don't hear much about the book of Judith anymore these days. And just to make sure that you are primed for it, I'm just going to tell you one thing you need to know, but much more when I read from it. And that is this. It's the greatest castration story in history. And the reason it isn't what you'd think. You probably know the outline of the story, but you probably have never read it because it's very badly translated. And in the story, you know, because so many great painters made pictures of it, Judith cut off the head of the Assyrian general who was coming to destroy Jerusalem. And she puts it in a bag and she carries the sack out of the camp of the Assyrians. And that's bad enough. But the point is, how is this a castration story? The point is, you'll hear when I read it to you. Holofernes had no castration anxiety, 0. That was his downfall. So if you ever read Freud, you can think about that. Anyway, but now I'm just going to read you a page. I got to choose which one. It's either going to be from Isaiah or from Ecclesiastes. They're also different. That was my point. So I've already told you that, so you don't need to know. You just have to trust me. Isaiah was a great, great poet, the Walt Whitman of early ancient Israel, who was actually 8 to 16 poets and was known as the School of Isaiah, and because he went on writing for 2 centuries. Well, nobody can go on writing for 2 centuries. So therefore, it was a school like the New York School, or give me some other writing schools. The school, the Bloomsbury, what do they call themselves? The Bloomsbury Group? In other words, several writers associated together who were all writing in the same way as Isaiah, and often in the voice of Isaiah. And I'd love to read you some of that, but I'll have to skip that because I want to read you a couple pages from Ecclesiastes, and then we'll stop for questions. Ecclesiastes has a name a pseudonym that's been assigned to him, and that is Kohelet. Kohelet is a Hebrew word, but all it means is no one's 100% sure, but they think it stands for minister or preacher, or really the head of the congregation. Well, usually anyone who's at the lectern is the head of the congregation at the moment. Right now, I'm the head of the congregation. So I could be Kohelet too. So there's no doubt in my mind that Kohelet is a writer and not a preacher first. So I'm going to read you a little part in this, and also the book of Ecclesiastes. This is the book I'm referring to in the Hebrew Bible. Is often, or is usually taken to be not poetry, but prose, and is thought to be a kind of what they called a wisdom book, because it dealt so much with, how to get up off the floor after life has knocked you down kind of thing. But in fact, it was my sense more and more that this is a poet working with a lot of old sources he's using, as a writer does today, in quotation, but he's transforming the quotations into his own work. I'm sure you'll do that one day and forget that you did it. So, let's see, is this a part that you will know? You all know parts of it, like, for everything there is a season and all that stuff. But that's in this book, but I'm going to read just one little part, because for me, this is where I, as an intertextual poet today, am writing what is no different than what John Ashbery would write as a poet. And yet there is a difference. And I started to talk about this with John Ashbery. But unfortunately, something happened. I don't remember. We never finished that conversation. I think it was something like, well, why do we have to read the Bible anyway? But my point about that is just what I said before. If you have no Bible, you have no Sophocles. You have no great classical source behind you that you've lost, and you deserve to have it in Western society. Anything that has a beginning, everything, was a seed in the pot, planted before existence, and named by men as it flowed into the world. Man is also a kind of flower, whose growth is defined, and all that flows from his hands, and with our own little names, we can't argue with our Creator. A name that's boundless, beyond identity. Like death, which takes back our names and gives them to the living. The more words we use, the more bricks for the mausoleum, building castles in the air that are ancient relics the moment we exhale, passed on to ignorant children when we die. They prefer sandcastles. And when the tide comes in, they will not cry, but watch, fascinated, no better or worse than all preceding men. Who knows what the right thing to do is with a life that walks across a stage of air in a bathing costume of flesh, until night falls like a gown over a beautiful woman who sleeps alone. Only our shadows remain, impotent watchmen on the shore of the life our blood flows to. And suddenly they too are gone, as the sun again rises, piercing all wishes and dreams and romances of the future with the bones of light. We are stripped awake, leaving a shadow on the shore that had not seen its own body. And that's just a piece of Ecclesiastes. You might have recognized that the line, "as the sun again rises," is what Ernest Hemingway took for his novel, The Sun Also Rises. So before I move on to Judith, tell me, have I said anything that's even slightly unusual, or you might want to ask me a question about? Yes?
Well, I'm curious because you mentioned a couple times we're familiar with certain stories, but in the case of pieces of scripture where the language itself has become terribly familiar, like Ecclesiastes 3 or like the 23rd Psalm, did you discover differences when you were translating it, or how did that work? Did that color it, that the language itself is so familiar in our culture?
Absolutely, right on. That's the right question. God, you can't say right on anymore, can you? Yes, of course, you have to work especially against the King James translation. But the fact is that I'm translating from the Hebrew. I grew up in Detroit, and I didn't know any more Hebrew than, well, I did. I had a little bit of Hebrew education when I was a youngster, but when I was at the new school, I'd forgotten it, and I was no different than you are. Unless there's someone, I don't mean to impugn anyone who does know Hebrew. But the point is, it wasn't until I lived several years in Israel that Hebrew became a spoken language for me, real speech, full of all kinds of things that real speech has, cliches, imagery, exaggerations, and especially anachronisms. So basically what you're asking me about is, I did translate the 23rd Psalm, it is in here. And I did have to look at the King James translation as an anachronism that I had to somehow transform. So that's what you have to do. Now, any translator might think that he's doing that, but it's a much harder thing to do than to actually want to do. Because like you said, it's in your, especially if you've ever went to church or synagogue, it's in your, no. Especially if you've watched any Western movies and all the criminals who were buried on Boot Hill all had the 23rd Psalm read over their bodies. Therefore, it's in your blood, those words are. So you have to deal with that. But of course, anyone who goes to church or synagogue, the whole Hebrew Bible, what you call Scripture, Scripture, of course, is just an ancient word for writing. But everyone forgets that it's writing. But anyway, that's what you have to do. You have to find a new way. And like I said, the way for me has always been to start with the writer. And those guys at Boot Hill, Wyatt Earp and the rest of them, I don't think they were thinking of the writer of the 23rd Psalm. I think they were thinking it all came from somewhere, because they weren't religious. They weren't going to church, obviously. So it's very interesting to think about. I like to watch old episodes of Gunsmoke where this often happens. What are they thinking? I mean, one moment they're in church, the next moment they're, in a posse. I mean, what are they thinking about where those words come from? Because these aren't stupid people. There are people just like us. Okay, they didn't go to college, maybe. All right. But any other questions? Shirley, yes.
It's really fascinating to think of these people as writers rather than as oracles or something. And I wondered what you found out about each of the writers' conception of the supernatural or God or Yahweh, if it was all connected in a very kind of cohesive theology, or if it was...
It was all connected in a cohesive culture, not a theology. And what that means is, I don't know. I don't think of the writers as especially religious. I know that sounds hard, and I'm willing to discuss it, but that's usually goes on when I have 1,000 people from a Baptist church in front of me. But it's happened a few times, but they never end up buying the book anyway. But no, these writers are working with a long tradition like you are. Now look, even Homer, who's writing only 2 or 3 centuries later than J and E in Greece. Even Homer, do you think he believed in all these gods that Odysseus is running into on his way back home? He actually believed that these gods actually exist? Calypso actually exists? I don't think, well, you may think so, but I don't think so. I don't think so, because the mythology of ancient Greece, which is what this consists of, was already the culture that Homer was writing in, and other people in the tradition called Homeric odes. And the gods they're referring to, they might have thought that earlier generations, I mean thousands of years before, or at least many centuries, believed in. But I don't know. I don't think they believed in it. I mean, I could give you many examples. I once talked to a Native American Indian about this, but never mind. There's something else I want to remind you of, since some of you are writing students. Since you are writing students, you probably read the New York Times Book Review, right? Just to see if there's any chance you'll ever make a buck, or whatever, right? Right? Or just to see what kind of junk is out there that you have to contend with. So, you didn't even write this in the... One of our very interesting cultural critics at this time is a guy named Daniel Mendelsohn. He's in his 30s, and you can read him almost anywhere. This is actually from the New Yorker, not from New York Times Book Review. But he's written everywhere, right? I mean, you can't read anything that's not written by Daniel Mendelsohn somewhere. He teaches at Bard College. But the most important thing is he's a translator of Greek poetry. And that's how I came to know of him. And in this, another article, I'm going to refer to 2 articles by Daniel. One was a review of the film Avatar. How do you say it? Avatar. I think people who say Avatar, there's something wrong with that. But anyway, it's a review of Avatar in the New Yorker when it first came out, in case any of you have seen it. But you've all heard of it. Obviously, Daniel's taking it very seriously. And obviously, the director is a serious director, James Cameron, and so on. But naturally, Mendelsohn has some criticisms of the movie. And one of his main criticisms is that he doesn't use this language, but I would say he criticizes Pandora. I'm not going to explain it to you, just in case you know it. If you don't, don't. He criticizes Pandora as mattering more in the movie than the real Kansas of history does in The Wizard of Oz. See, in the end of The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy goes back to Kansas. That's reality. But the reality in Avatar never gets to be as real, interesting, or vital as the world of Pandora, this fantasy land. Now that's his primary criticism. And one other thing, Mendelssohn's basic idea on Greek myth is that the Greek poets made their poetry out of myth and not history. There's plenty of history in it, in the Iliad and even Greek lyric poems. There's history in it, but the main concern is the myth. The main concern for Odysseus and in the Odyssey is that how incredibly theatrically devastating all these confrontations between supernatural beings and Odysseus are. So, and what makes them incredible, of course, is they're commonplace. I mean, obviously, if you come to an island, there's going to be a cyclops on it, and so on. So, my point here is that the biblical poets who were writing earlier and parallel to the Greek poets were mainly different in this sense. They really cared more about Kansas than Pandora. They were really much more concerned about history than they were with myth. And in fact, they tended to discount all myth. So you're going to ask me, well, there seems like there's some myth here. But the point is, when they use myth, they usually demystify it, turn it inside out, transform it. And the ultimate proof I will leave you with is that that's why the monotheistic God of Israel is the God of history. I don't think anyone would have thought of Zeus as the God of history. Did that answer some of your question? Great. And anybody have anything else you want to bring up? Yeah? Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned that the Tower of Babel, the story was actually the ziggurat of Ur. Are you saying they're the same building, or is it the one was destroyed? Because I know the ziggurat of Ur actually still exists, like it still stands to this day, and the Tower of Babel in the story was destroyed.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I love those kind of questions because you're asking for real historical accuracy, and this is what the biblical authors were concerned with as well. They didn't have to explain a lot to their audience because they already knew it. They didn't have to tell the audience of the Bible about Sumer and Egypt. They already knew it. It isn't like they didn't know it. I mean, we're talking about the educated class, that's the audience. So your question, actually, I was kind of laughing because you said it still stands. Well, it was actually buried. They had to dig it up, right? So they dug it up in the 1930s. The great archaeologist of all time, Leonard Woolley. And the fact is that I recommend you read him. You'll find lots of books by him. He writes as good as a writer. He is a writer. So anyway, that ziggurat, what I meant was it's a model. That ziggurat of Ur was a model for the Tower of Babel that the Israeli biblical writer is writing about. Everyone who's hearing it knows he's talking about that ziggurat. Why? Because the ziggurat of Ur was known as the Great Tower, and there was Sumerian poetry about how, what happened to it, they never finished it, and so on. So you can get into all kinds of historical things. Sometimes they're less interesting, but there's always a basis for it. Anything else? Do I have any time to read a few pages of Judith? I don't want to keep anyone from dinner.
5 minutes? Because it isn't dinner, some of them have 8 o'clock class.
Oh, yeah. Well, we wouldn't want to miss that. Okay, it's only 1:45. Because these people are not interested in castration anxiety, that's why. I don't know, I'd skip part of a class for that. But anyway. Just in case I talked as fast as I usually do, I had even more to read for you, but I seem to have slowed down. It was thanks to Robert, who made sure he talked to me for at least half an hour and slowed me down. This is just 2 pages from the book of Judith. And I can't tell you much about it because that'll take up to 5 minutes. You'll have to either get my book or some other book because to know who Judith was. But in the words of the great 19th century art critic John Ruskin, the greatest and most beautiful woman ever presented to the mind of a man. I thought that was, what does John Ruskin know? But anyway. But now, this is before, I just have to tell you this much. This is before Judith is going on her mission to kill the king of, not the king, the head general of the Assyrian army, which has come to commit genocide in Israel. Now this king, I was world famous because he destroyed plenty of other countries too already. And we know him as Holofernes, which is just a Latinization of his Hebrew name. Hebrew is pretty close to the original because Assyria also had a Semitic language, Assyrian. But anyway, before Judith goes to do this, and now you can begin to understand why this is not in the regular Hebrew Bible. It's scripture, but it's in what the Catholic Bible calls the Apocrypha. It was a little too much for the rabbis. Most of it was not too much for them. I wish I could explain to you why. But they always thought bad people and evil people deserved to die. But they always had the idea that we shouldn't have to kill them ourselves. They should die as a result of their own hand, for not necessarily suicide, but just get entangled in their own plot. In some way, it's God doing his work, but not directly, because God never does that. They're always careful that the supernatural God doesn't do that unless they are referring in an anachronistic way to myth. But in this case, Judith is unavoidable. She just, slices off his neck. And in order to do it, she had to get him drunk. And in order to get him drunk, that's all part of the story. I mean, it's not easy. And it's not easy for her to get into his bed. And, she was just a Jewish girl from Israel. But that's the story. Now, before she goes, she says a little prayer. Anybody going on a mission like this would say a little prayer. But, obviously, all our soldiers in Iraq or anywhere are going to say a little prayer before they go on any mission. Then Judith kneeled, put her face in the dust, stripped to the sackcloth She wore underneath, forgot to tell you, she's a widow. Just at the moment the evening incense offering wafted to the temple ceiling in Jerusalem, cupped her face in her hands and spoke, her words rising outspoken from her heart to the open sky and offering a prayer. Lord, God of my fathers, of Simon, in whose hand you put a sword to reward the strangers who stripped off a young girl's dress to her shame. That's the story of Dinah in Scripture. Bared the innocents between her thighs to her deep confusion and forced into her womb, raped her in shock to demean and disgrace her. This might have bothered the rabbis a bit too. The story in Dinah isn't as graphic. For you have said in the Torah, this is an outrage, and you allowed these violators to be surprised in their beds of deceit, the sheets stripped off them, their beds blushing with shame, stained with their blood. For the Lord among these strangers, you allowed equal treatment with their slaves. Slain on their thrones, their servants in their arms, their wives and daughters allowed to be spared, captured and dispersed. This is all very ironic. So you know she's one smart woman. Their possessions fell into the hands of the sons you loved, for they listened to you and were outraged at the demeaning of a sister's blood. They called on you for help and you listened. Lord, my Lord, now hear this widow's selfless words. You gave shape to the past, and beneath what is happening now is your supportive hand. You have thought about the future, and those thoughts live as men and women. Here we are, they say. Your thoughts are alive in the present, and you've cleared paths for them into the future. Look, here we are, exposed to the Assyrians, parading their well-oiled muscle, preening in the mirrors of their polished shields, bullying the hills with their herds of infantry, vanity worn on their sleeves, tin armor, their spears thrusting forward, their trust in their legs and horses, their pride in the naked tips of their arrows, their hope in thoughts of total domination. So locked in the embrace of themselves, they can't know you are Lord over all, fierce in your shattering of wars themselves. Great armies of the past are dust in your presence. They were lords in their own eyes as they marched on blindly, but there is only one Lord. I think I'm going to stop there because it gets even more dramatic, but that's probably the 5 minutes.